The candle flickered against the salt-stained maps scattered across the wooden table, as Christopher Columbus traced his finger along the imagined westward route to the Indies. It was 1491, and the generous navigator sat in his modest quarters in Cordoba, Spain, surrounded by the tools of his obsession, astrolabes, compass roses, and treatises on geography that most scholars dismissed as fantasy. Outside, the Spanish Reconquista was reaching its climax, but Columbus's mind sailed beyond the Mediterranean, beyond the known world itself. Columbus had spent years perfecting his calculations, convinced that the earth was smaller than most scholars believed. He had studied Pierre d'Elias Imago Mundi and Marco Polo's accounts of the Orient, becoming certain that sailing west across the ocean sea would provide a shorter route to the spice-rich lands of Cathay and Chipangu than the treacherous overland paths or the Portuguese route around Africa. His conviction burned with the intensity of religious fervor, for Columbus saw himself as chosen by divine providence to spread Christianity to distant lands. The navigator's weathered hands bore the scars of countless voyages in the Mediterranean and along the African coast. He had sailed with Portuguese expeditions, witnessed their systematic exploration of the West African coastline, and understood the immense profits that awaited whoever could establish a direct trade route to Asia. The Portuguese had rounded the Cape of Good Hope just 4 years earlier under Bartolomeu Dias, but their route was long and perilous. Columbus believed his western path would revolutionize global commerce. Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II had initially rejected his proposal 3 times. The Royal Commission of Scholars had deemed his calculations flawed, his estimates of oceanic distances impossibly optimistic. They called him a dreamer, a madman who would sail off the edge of the world. But Columbus possessed something more powerful than mathematical precision, unshakable faith in his destiny. He had traveled from court to court across Europe, from Portugal to England to France, seeking a monarch bold enough to finance his vision. The fall of Granada in January 1492 changed everything. With the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia conquered, the Catholic monarchs found themselves with resources and attention to spare for new ventures. Louis de Santangle, the royal treasurer, had urged the crown to reconsider Columbus's proposal, arguing that the potential rewards far outweighed the modest investment required. The navigator's persistence had finally found fertile ground in a kingdom flush with victory and hungry for new sources of wealth. As Columbus prepared for his final audience with the royal court, he carried with him more than nautical charts and mathematical calculations. He bore the weight of centuries of European isolation from the riches of the East, the accumulated frustration of merchants who watched their gold flow into the coffers of Middle Eastern middlemen. His proposed voyage represented not merely a navigational experiment, but a potential liberation from economic dependence on hostile powers. The implications of success stretched far beyond personal glory or royal profit. If Columbus could indeed reach the Indies by sailing west, he would shatter the geographical barriers that had confined European civilization to its small corner of the world. Trade routes that had remained unchanged since antiquity would become obsolete overnight. The balance of global power would shift toward whatever nation controlled this new maritime highway. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Columbus reviewed his final preparations, he could not have imagined the true magnitude of what lay ahead. His miscalculations about the Earth's size would prove both his greatest error and his most fortunate mistake, leading him not to the spice markets of Asia, but to continents whose very existence would redefine humanity's understanding of the world itself. The great hall of the Alcazar in Cordoba echoed with the rustle of silk and the murmur of courtiers, as Christopher Columbus approached the throne for what he knew would be his final opportunity. Queen Isabella, resplendent in cloth of gold, studied the weathered navigator with calculating eyes, while King Ferdinand leaned forward with the practical interest of a merchant, evaluating a risky investment. It was April 1492. And the fate of global exploration hung in the balance of this moment. Columbus had learned to read the subtle language of royal courts. During his years of supplication, the Queen's slight nod to Louis de Santangle, the treasurer who had become his most influential advocate, suggested that political winds had shifted in his favor. The recent conquest of Granada had filled the royal coffers and freed military resources. But more importantly, it had awakened Spanish ambitions for global expansion that could rival Portuguese achievements in Africa and the Indian Ocean. The capitulations of Santa Fe, the agreement hammered out between Columbus and the Crown's representatives, reflected the audacious nature of the enterprise. Columbus would receive the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, governorship of any lands he discovered, and a tenth of all precious metals, spices, and trading profits generated by his route. These terms, which had seemed impossibly generous to previous negotiators, now appeared reasonable given the potential rewards of direct access to Asian markets. Behind the ceremony lay years of careful preparation by Spanish officials who understood the strategic implications of Columbus's proposal. The Portuguese had established a monopoly on the eastern route to Asia through their systematic exploration of the African coast, their fortress at São Jorge de Mina on the Gold Coast, their trading post in the Indian Ocean, and their recent success in rounding the Cape of Good Hope had given them overwhelming advantages in the spice trade. Spain needed an alternative route to compete effectively in global commerce. Columbus's three ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niga, represented far more than the modest fleet their size might suggest, according to historical accounts documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Admiral of the Ocean Sea. These vessels embodied the cutting edge of 15th century maritime technology, combining the best features of Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding traditions. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, measured only about 100 feet in length but carried advanced navigational instruments and provisions for an unprecedented oceanic voyage. The crew of 90 men assembled for the expedition reflected the social complexity of late medieval Spain, alongside experienced sailors and navigational experts. Columbus recruited former prisoners seeking redemption, conversos fleeing religious persecution, and ambitious young men drawn by promises of wealth and glory. This diverse company would carry European civilization across an ocean gap that had remained unbridged since the continents had drifted apart millions of years earlier. The expedition's departure from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492, marked the beginning of humanity's first systematic attempt to traverse the Atlantic Ocean. Previous ventures, including possible Viking expeditions to North America, had been limited in scope and had failed to establish permanent connections between continents. Columbus's voyage represented the first organized effort to create a sustainable transoceanic trade route. As the three ships disappeared beyond the horizon, they carried with them the accumulated knowledge of generations of European navigators, cartographers, and explorers. Columbus had studied the wind patterns observed by Portuguese sailors, analyzed the ocean currents documented by ancient geographers, and calculated optimal routes based on the most advanced geographical theories of his time. His departure represented not an individual adventure, but the culmination of centuries of gradual expansion of European maritime capabilities. The political ramifications of the expedition extended far beyond Spanish borders. Portuguese spies had undoubtedly reported the preparations to King John II, who had previously rejected Columbus's proposals and must have watched the Spanish expedition with considerable anxiety. French and English merchants, already struggling to compete with Iberian trade networks, would face even greater disadvantage if Spain succeeded in establishing direct access to Asian markets through a western route. The morning of August 3, 1492 dawned clear and promising as Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, watching the Spanish coastline fade into the eastern horizon. The weight of command settled upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak as he calculated their position using the astrolabe and compass that would guide them across uncharted waters. Behind him, the ports of Palos de la Frontera grew smaller with each passing hour, while ahead lay an ocean that no European had successfully crossed and returned to tell the tale. The first weeks of the voyage tested both equipment and morale, as the small fleet encountered the typical challenges of Atlantic navigation, the trade winds that Portuguese explorers had learned to exploit along the African coast carried Columbus's ships steadily westward, but the crew had never been so far from any known landfall for such an extended period. Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta and an experienced navigator in his own right, provided crucial support during these early stages. When doubts about the expedition's wisdom began to surface among the sailors, Columbus maintained detailed logs of their progress, recording wind patterns, ocean currents, and celestial observations with the meticulous care of a scientist conducting an unprecedented experiment. His calculations suggested they were making excellent time toward the Indies, though he kept two sets of records, one accurate log for his own use, and another with reduced distances to prevent the crew from realizing how far they had traveled. from any possibility of rescue if the voyage failed. By early September, the expedition had reached the Sargasso Sea, a vast expanse of floating seaweed that convinced some sailors they were approaching land while terrifying others with visions of their ships becoming trapped in oceanic vegetation. Columbus recognized the seaweed as a sign that they were following ocean currents that might lead to distant shores, but he struggled to maintain crew discipline as homesickness and fear of the unknown grew stronger. With each passing day, the appearance of land birds flying overhead in late September provided the first concrete evidence that their destination might be within reach. Columbus had studied accounts of how Portuguese navigators used bird flight patterns to locate islands off the African coast, and he applied this knowledge to modify their course slightly southward. These subtle adjustments in navigation, based on natural signs rather than mathematical calculations, demonstrated the practical seamanship that complemented his theoretical knowledge of geography. The night of October 11th brought unprecedented tension to the small fleet, as conflicting interpretations of various signs, cloud formations, changes in water color, and floating debris divided opinion about their proximity to land. Some crew members had begun to whisper about mutiny, suggesting they should abandon the venture and return to Spain before their provisions ran dangerously low. Columbus knew that his authority depended on reaching land within the next few days, or risk losing control of the expedition entirely. At 2 o'clock in the morning of October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, spotted a white cliff gleaming in the moonlight ahead of their course. His cry of "Tierra, Tierra," electrified the three ships as crew members rushed to the railings to witness the sight that would transform human understanding of planetary geography. The long-sought landfall had finally appeared, though none of the Europeans aboard could have imagined how completely it would exceed their wildest expectations. The island they approached, which Columbus would name San Salvador, represented far more than the successful completion of a navigational challenge. This small piece of land rising from the western Atlantic marked the first point of contact between two hemispheres that had developed in complete isolation from each other for tens of thousands of years. The indigenous Taino people who inhabited the island were about to encounter visitors from a continent they had never imagined existed, while the Europeans were approaching shores that would prove to belong not to Asia, but to entirely unknown continents. As dawn broke over the New World on October 12, 1492, Columbus prepared to set foot on land that would revolutionize global trade, politics, and culture in ways that no single voyage had ever accomplished. The success of his navigational gamble would trigger an age of exploration that would connect all the inhabited continents for the first time in human history, creating the first truly global civilization, while simultaneously destroying countless indigenous societies that had flourished in isolation for millennia. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine beach of San Salvador as Christopher Columbus, dressed in his finest scarlet doublet and carrying the royal standard of Castile and Lean, stepped on sand that no European foot had ever touched. The date was October 12, 1492, and the moment marked the beginning of permanent contact between the eastern and western hemispheres. Behind him, Martin Alonso Pinzon and Vicente Alves Pinzon, captains of the accompanying vessels, followed with their own banners. While the assembled crews witnessed history unfolding on this small Caribbean island, the indigenous Taino people, who emerged from the tropical forest to observe these strange visitors, possessed a sophisticated understanding of their island world that had developed over centuries of careful adaptation to the Caribbean environment. Led by their cacique, these peaceful agriculturalists had created a sustainable society based on cassava cultivation, skilled craftsmanship, and complex trade networks that connected islands throughout the region. Their initial curiosity about the pale-skinned strangers who had arrived in enormous canoes would soon transform into comprehension of the profound changes these visitors would bring to their world. Columbus immediately recognized that these were not the spice merchants of Cathay or the silk traders of Chipangu that he had expected to encounter. The Taino wore no elaborate silk garments, possessed no obvious stores of precious metals, and spoke no language that resembled the Asian tongues described by Marco Polo. Yet their gold-nosed rings and armlets suggested that the precious metal existed somewhere in these lands, confirming his belief that he had reached the outer islands of the Indies archipelago. Described by ancient geographers. The admiral's journal entries meticulously recorded during these first days of exploration, revealed both his growing excitement about the commercial possibilities of these new lands and his gradual realization that he had discovered something far more significant than an alternative route to known Asian markets. The Taino demonstrated remarkable navigation skills in their ocean-going canoes, suggesting the existence of numerous populated islands throughout the region. Their cotton textiles, though simple by European standards, indicated agricultural sophistication that could support colonial settlements. Following established protocols for claiming new territories, Columbus performed the formal ceremony of possession, planning the Spanish royal standard while his notary, Rodrigo de Escobedo, recorded the legal details that would establish Spanish sovereignty over these lands. The Taino observers could not have understood the legal implications of this ritual, which according to European law transferred ownership of their ancestral territories to distant monarchs they had never heard of, but they responded with generous hospitality that impressed the Spanish visitors. The expedition spent several days exploring San Salvador and neighboring islands, with Columbus serving as an amateur ethnographer, documenting the customs, technologies, and social organization of peoples who had never appeared in any European geographical treatise. His descriptions of Taino agricultural techniques, religious practices, and political structure provided the first systematic European observations of New World societies, though his interpretations were inevitably filtered through assumptions about Asian cultures that bore little resemblance to Caribbean realities. Trade relationships developed quickly between the two groups, with Europeans offering glass beads, brass bells, and red cloth caps in exchange for cotton thread, parrots, and small amounts of worked gold. These peaceful commercial interactions, conducted through gestures and basic sign language, established patterns that would characterize early European indigenous relations. Throughout the Americas, the Taino valued European metal goods and colorful textiles, while Columbus coveted any items that might indicate the presence of precious metals or valuable spices in the region. The admiral's growing confidence in the commercial potential of his discovery led him to expand his exploration to include several neighboring islands, each offering new evidence of the region's complexity and diversity. Cuba, which Columbus initially believed might be a peninsula of the Asian mainland, proved to be another large island with its own distinct indigenous populations and natural resources. The expedition's encounter with the Lucayan people demonstrated that the Caribbean contained numerous sophisticated societies, with extensive inter-island trade networks. As October progressed, Columbus faced the crucial decision of whether to continue exploring these fascinating new lands or return to Spain. With evidence of his success, his provisions were adequate for several more months of exploration, but the approaching winter season would make Atlantic navigation increasingly dangerous. The crew had recovered their enthusiasm following the successful landfall, but extended exploration might again test their patience and loyalty. The admiral chose to continue his Caribbean exploration, a decision that would provide additional evidence of the scope and significance of his discovery. The trade winds carried Columbus and his fleet through the crystalline waters of the Caribbean archipelago as October 1492 gave way to November, revealing island after island that challenged every assumption about the geography of the Western Ocean. Each new landfall brought fresh encounters with indigenous peoples whose diversity and sophistication contradicted European expectations about the inhabitants of remote oceanic islands. The admiral found himself documenting not merely an alternative route to Asia, but an entirely unknown region of extraordinary complexity and promise. Cuba, the largest island Columbus encountered during this phase of exploration, initially convinced him that he had finally reached the mainland of Cathay described in Marco Polo's accounts. The island's size, mountainous interior, and abundant rivers suggested continental proportions that might extend indefinitely westward toward the great cities of Asia. Indigenous inhabitants spoke of vast lands beyond the horizon and powerful rulers who controlled extensive territories, feeding Columbus's conviction that the Great Khan's empire lay just beyond his current position. The expedition's exploration of Cuba's northern coast revealed both the promise and the challenges of these new lands for European colonization. Magnificent harbors capable of sheltering entire fleets offered strategic advantages for establishing permanent settlements, while fertile river valleys showed clear potential for European-style agriculture. However, the absence of obvious precious metal deposits disappointed crew members who had expected to find gold as abundant as the Portuguese had discovered along the African coast. Columbus's encounters with the Siboney and other Cuban indigenous groups provided additional evidence of the region's cultural complexity. These peoples demonstrated advanced knowledge of astronomy, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and artistic traditions that produced intricate pottery and textiles. Their political organization, based on alliances between numerous caciques controlling different territories, resembled the decentralized kingdoms that European merchants had encountered in Southeast Asia rather than the primitive tribal societies that many crew members had expected to find. The discovery of Hispaniola in December 1492 marked the climax of Columbus's Caribbean exploration and provided the evidence of mineral wealth that would justify his claims about the commercial potential of the western route. The island's indigenous Taino inhabitants possessed significantly more worked gold than previous groups encountered, suggesting proximity to mining areas that could support large-scale extraction operations. Their descriptions of gold sources in the island's mountainous interior convinced Columbus that he had finally located the precious metal deposits that would make his voyage profitable for the Spanish crown. Tragedy struck the expedition on Christmas Eve when the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef off Hispaniola's northern coast, creating the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. Through necessity rather than design, Columbus ordered the construction of La Navidad, a fortified encampment built from the flagship's salvaged timbers, and left 39 volunteers under the command of Diego de Arana to establish Spanish presence on the island. This impromptu colony represented the beginning of permanent European occupation of the New World, though none of its founders could have anticipated the profound consequences of their presence. The loss of his flagship forced Columbus to reconsider his exploration plans and begin preparing for the return voyage to Spain. The remaining two vessels, the Pinta and the Niga, provided adequate capacity for the reduced crew, but their limited cargo space meant that the admiral could bring back only small samples of the region's potential wealth: gold ornaments, exotic birds, cotton textiles, and several indigenous volunteers would have to serve as evidence of the discoveries that would revolutionize global trade and politics. The successful establishment of peaceful relationships with Cacique Guacanagari and other Hispaniola leaders provided Columbus with crucial information about the island's geography, resources, and political structure, according to research documented in William D. Phillips Jr. and Carla Rand Phillips's The Worlds of Christopher Columbus. These indigenous allies described extensive gold deposits in the Cibao region and confirmed the existence of large populations throughout the Caribbean islands, information that would prove vital for planning future colonization efforts. The admiral's decision to begin the return voyage in January 1493 reflected both practical necessities and strategic considerations about presenting his discoveries to the Spanish court. Extended exploration might have provided additional evidence of the region's wealth and complexity, but successful return to Europe with proof of his achievement took precedence over comprehensive geographical survey. The samples and documentation he had collected would have to suffice to convince Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and to finance expanded exploration and colonization of these remarkable new lands. As the Niga and Pinta departed Hispaniola on January 16, 1493, they carried not merely the survivors of a successful voyage of exploration, but the seeds of a transformation that would reshape global civilization. The indigenous peoples watching from the shore could not have imagined that this departure marked only a brief intermission before waves of European colonists would arrive to claim their lands and subordinate their societies to alien political and economic systems. The departure from Hispaniola on January 16, 1493, marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most dangerous phase of Columbus's historic voyage. The two remaining vessels, the Niga and the Pinta, faced the daunting prospect of crossing nearly 4,000 miles of winter Atlantic without accurate knowledge of winds and currents that might aid or hinder their eastward progress. The admiral carried precious cargo that could revolutionize European understanding of world geography. But first, he had to survive an ocean crossing that would test both his navigational skills and the seaworthiness of ships never designed for such extended oceanic voyages. The initial weeks of the return journey proceeded smoothly as favorable trade winds carried the small fleet northeastward through familiar Caribbean waters toward the open Atlantic. Columbus had learned valuable lessons about Atlantic wind patterns during his outbound voyage, and he applied this knowledge to plot a more northerly return route that would take advantage of the westerly winds that dominated the North Atlantic during winter months. His strategy demonstrated the practical seamanship that complemented his theoretical understanding of global geography. The separation of the Pinta under Martin Alonso Pinzan's command in early February created additional anxiety for Columbus, who now faced the possibility that his carefully documented evidence of the discoveries might be lost if both ships encountered disaster during the Atlantic crossing. Pinzan had grown increasingly independent during the Caribbean exploration, and his decision to pursue a separate course home reflected both practical navigation concerns and personal ambitions that threatened Columbus's exclusive credit for the expedition's success. By mid-February, the Nika encountered the violent winter storms that made North Atlantic navigation so treacherous. During the cold months, waves towering higher than the ship's masts crashed across the deck, while hurricane-force winds shredded sails and threatened to drive the vessel beneath the churning waters. Columbus faced the navigator's ultimate test as he struggled to maintain course toward Europe while his crew prepared for what seemed inevitable shipwreck. In the midst of the ocean they had crossed with such confidence just months earlier, the admiral's leadership during this crisis demonstrated the qualities that had enabled him to convince European monarchs to finance his unprecedented venture, rather than succumb to despair as conditions deteriorated. He maintained detailed navigational records, rationed provisions to extend their survival time, and encouraged his exhausted crew with reminders of the historical significance of their mission. His conviction that divine providence had chosen him to connect the hemispheres sustained both his own morale and that of the men whose lives depended on his decisions. The storm that nearly destroyed the expedition in mid-February also provided the navigational breakthrough that enabled their survival. Columbus recognized that the fierce westerly winds driving the Tempest would carry them toward Europe if he could maintain sufficient control to prevent the ship from capsizing or breaking apart under the tremendous strain. His decision to run before the storm rather than attempt to resist its force demonstrated the intuitive seamanship that complemented his mathematical approach to navigation. The first sight of European land in early March brought overwhelming relief to the survivors, though their initial landfall at the Azores created new diplomatic complications. Portuguese officials on Santa Maria Island detained several crew members, suspecting that the Spanish expedition had violated Portugal's exclusive rights to exploration in the Atlantic. Columbus found himself negotiating with authorities who viewed his success as a potential threat to Portuguese dominance in oceanic exploration and global trade. The diplomatic crisis at the Azores reflected the broader geopolitical implications of Columbus's achievement. Portugal's Treaty of Alcacovas with Spain had attempted to divide Atlantic exploration zones between the two kingdoms, but Columbus's discovery of inhabited lands far to the west raised complex questions about the geographical limits of these agreements. Portuguese officials recognized that Spanish success in establishing a western route to Asian markets could undermine their monopoly on the lucrative spice trade. The final approach to European waters brought Columbus face to face with a fierce Atlantic storm that drove the Nika toward the Portuguese coast rather than Spanish ports. The admiral's unplanned landing at Lisbon on March 4, 1493, created the remarkable situation of the Spanish explorer having to present his discoveries first to King John II of Portugal, the monarch who had previously rejected his proposals for westward exploration, and must now confront the consequences of that decision. The audience with King John proved both diplomatically delicate and personally satisfying for Columbus, who could now demonstrate the validity of theories that Portuguese scholars had dismissed as impossible fantasies. The indigenous Americans accompanying the expedition, the samples of New World gold and exotic products, and the detailed charts of newly discovered islands provided undeniable evidence that Columbus had indeed succeeded in crossing the ocean sea and establishing contact with previously unknown lands. The bells of Palos de la Frontera rang out across the Spanish port as the travel-worn Nika limped into harbor on March 15, 1493, completing one of the most consequential voyages in human history. Christopher Columbus, now bearing the title Admiral of the ocean sea that had seemed so presumptuous when granted 8 months earlier, stood on deck surrounded by evidence that would transform European understanding of the world's geography and Spain's position among the kingdoms of Europe. The indigenous Taino men accompanying him represented the first Americans to set foot on European soil, while the samples of gold, exotic birds, and New World plants provided tangible proof of discoveries that exceeded even Columbus's most optimistic predictions. Word of the admiral's return spread rapidly through Spain and across Europe, carried by merchants, diplomats, and church officials who recognized the profound implications of successful westward navigation to inhabited lands. The letter Columbus had composed during his voyage, describing the fertility of the islands, the sophistication of their inhabitants, and the abundance of gold and spices that awaited Spanish exploitation, circulated in manuscript copies that would soon become Europe's first printed accounts of the New World. These documents established Columbus as the herald of a new age of exploration and colonization that would extend European influence across the globe. The triumphal procession from Palos to the court at Barcelona demonstrated the Spanish monarchy's immediate recognition of Columbus's achievement and its strategic implications for the kingdom's future. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand ordered elaborate ceremonies to honor the admiral and display the exotic treasures he had brought from across the ocean sea. The Taino men, dressed in feathers and gold ornaments, provided living proof that Columbus had indeed reached inhabited lands, while parrots, pineapples, and other New World specimens fascinated courtiers who had never imagined such diversity existed beyond the familiar Mediterranean world. The papal bulls issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, particularly Inter Caetera, established the legal framework for Spanish colonization of Columbus's discoveries, while creating the diplomatic crisis that would lead to the Treaty of Tordesillas with Portugal. These documents granted Spain exclusive rights to all lands discovered west of a meridian line, drawn 100 leagues beyond the Azores, effectively dividing the non-Christian world between the two great Catholic maritime powers. The Pope's decision reflected both his Spanish origins and his recognition that Columbus's voyage had created new opportunities for spreading Christianity to previously unknown populations. The immediate preparation for a second, much larger expedition demonstrated Spanish determination to capitalize quickly on Columbus's discoveries before other European powers could challenge their claims to these new lands. The fleet of 17 ships and approximately 1,500 colonists that departed Cadiz in September 1493 represented the largest overseas colonization effort in European history to that point. This massive investment of royal resources confirmed that Columbus had convinced the Spanish crown of the New World's immense potential for generating wealth through gold extraction, agricultural development, and trade with Asian markets that supposedly lay just beyond the newly discovered islands. The establishment of permanent Spanish settlements in the Caribbean marked the beginning of systematic European colonization of the Americas and the transformation of indigenous societies that had developed in isolation for thousands of years. Columbus's role as the first colonial governor of Hispaniola revealed both his limitations as an administrator and the inherent conflicts between Spanish colonial ambitions and indigenous rights that would characterize European expansion throughout the New World. The encomienda system that emerged from these early settlements created the legal framework for exploiting indigenous labor while ostensibly protecting native populations through Christian conversion and Spanish protection. The broader consequences of Columbus's successful voyage extended far beyond the immediate establishment of Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. His demonstration that oceanic barriers could be crossed with existing maritime technology encouraged explorers from other European nations to seek their own routes to Asian markets and American territories. Within a decade of Columbus's return, Portuguese, English, and French expeditions were probing the Atlantic coastlines of both North and South America, beginning the age of global exploration that would connect all inhabited continents for the first time in human history. The transformation of global trade patterns triggered by Columbus's discovery created new centers of economic power while destroying traditional commercial relationships that had dominated international commerce for centuries. The influx of American silver into European markets revolutionized the monetary systems of the Old World, while new agricultural products like maize, potatoes, and tobacco transformed European diets and economies. The Atlantic Ocean, which had previously served as an insurmountable barrier between civilizations, became the primary highway for global commerce and cultural exchange. Columbus's voyage represented more than a navigational achievement or the beginning of Spanish colonial empire. It marked the end of human isolation between hemispheres and the beginning of the first truly global civilization. The consequences of that October morning, when he first stepped onto the beaches of San Salvador, continue to shape world history. Today, as the connections he established between the Eastern and Western hemispheres created the interconnected world system that defines modern international relations, global economics, and cultural exchange across all continents.